If you'd like to support this podcast, you can become a patron of the show by making a small monthly contribution through my Patreon page. To do that, you can either search for me on patreon.com or use the link in the upper right-hand corner of my website, Kunstler.com. It's a pleasure to welcome back Piero San Giorgio, who came on this podcast some time ago to talk about his excellent book, Survive the Economic Collapse, A Practical Guide. And today I'm chatting with Piero on Skype at his home in Switzerland to talk about his new book, Women on the Verge of a Societal Breakdown, Preserving Hard-Won Victories During an Age of Uncertainty. The book's published by the Club Orlov Press, and yes, that's our chum Dmitry Orlov, author of many splendid books on the subject of how we are going to greet the future. And you can find the book on Amazon. And yeah, I can hear some of you muttering, the effrontery, two dudes talking about women. Well, there's no law against it, at least not yet, and we're going to give it a shot. So let us know if you think that this was a fair discussion. And without further ado, here's Piero San Giorgio. Piero, you have a new book out called Women on the Verge of a Societal Breakdown, which I guess is kind of a pun on Pedro Almodovar's movie Women on the Verge of a Nervous Breakdown.
It is. And it was the same pun and the same joke with the French title.
Well, the subtitle of that book is Preserving Hard-Won Victories During an Age of Uncertainty. First, I want to tell you a little bit about my experience with my women readers with my World Made by Hand series of novels. They were very angry. I got a lot of angry mail from them complaining that the female characters in my book were not being shown as being in charge enough of enough things, or they seemed to be too subordinate to men, or, they were the kind of complaints that I think might have been predictable. But what surprised me most was the failure of intelligent people to imagine that social relations would be very different in an economy that was very different, the economy of my World Made by Hand novels of the future, in which there has been an economic collapse. And I found it rather strange that this kind of poverty of imagination had taken over people who were otherwise intelligent.
I concur. What led me to write this book was my first book, Survive the Economic Collapse, which we've talked already once, was very successful. And looking at the social network ratio of women to men that were following what I was saying, and in some ways, some statistics that I had of who was buying the book, I thought that a book that talks about the future was oddly written mostly about men. And the ratio was probably 85% to 15. And I was curious because I thought, well, after all, I'm talking about a difficult future, not unlike your books. And usually women who have children, who are the species is all about women. They are the ones who make children and therefore enable the future. And all of what men do is about seducing and being good enough and protecting women for generating the next generations. And I was curious, why are women not interested about the future? So I asked a few of the readers, and they were all telling me a certain story. Some of them I related in the book. Most of them I related in the book. And what I found out is that, contrary to the past, and contrary to most of history, where women had a significant part, contrary to maybe what some propaganda about the so-called patriarchy is saying these days, women had an important part in, of course, the family and, of course, society. And indeed, they were very concerned about the future and had a strong influence on their men on being careful and being thoughtful about what preparing a future was. And they were very concerned about the very hardships and very difficult elements of life that has always accompanied the human societies and human families. The future was always difficult and uncertain. You may have starvation, the crops may fail, the weather might not be good, there could be war, invasion, migration from people who would kill you and enslave you. this has been the story of humanity for forever.
Mm-hmm.
And women were part of protecting the children and played an important part of that. Today, it's not the case anymore. Mm-hmm. Today, we became very comfortable. And I describe, in fact, in the beginning of the book, why we have been living in the century of women from, let's say, 100 years ago to now, basically starting with the First World War. Women have attained, sometimes through struggle, sometimes through the effects of socialism, and sometimes, and I think mostly because of technology, which has enabled women to go away from the core chores of the house, which were very important, by the way. I'm not saying this is bad. It was very important, having a decent house, taking care of the children. This is very important. But suddenly with technology, especially after World War II, and with not so much the women liberation, but really the fact that because of the wars, World War I and II, women had to work in the factories and therefore gain the experience and the moral authority to say, well, after all, we can also do it. We can also be part of the industry of, at least symbolically and in terms of purchasing power. And that has led to a process that after World War II and that has accelerated in the last maybe 40 to 50 years, has made women very independent, especially as we live at least in the Western world, we value a lot information and tertiary kind of jobs. Women are very good at that. There's no question that women have, it may sound a bit silly for me to even say that, but it's obvious that women are very smart and able to do a lot of the intellectual jobs that men were also able to do. There's not a lot of women liberation for having women working in building houses. And, you notice that it's always for high-paying intellectual jobs that there is a women emancipation movement.
Yeah.
But still,
and there's a coffee machine available down the hall.
Yeah, and therefore it is true that women have had a fantastic ride over the last 100 years. And it could explain, in part, and there's another reason, but that evolution can explain that suddenly they don't need to care so much about the future because the ride has been so fantastic for women and for men that no one needs to care about the future because, hey, we know that it's always going to be better. And you and I and your readers and my readers know that, unfortunately, this is not going to be like that. But there's another reason. I think that women have been played. They have been crooked by, if you say the powers that be, but I would say the
zeitgeist.
The zeitgeist, exactly. The machinery of the way things are, women have been lured into the consumption machine. And because of maybe they care even more than men about looking good and seduction, which of course is a bit more cruel for women as they age compared to men, they consume a lot. And that has been understood by the industries that target more and more women over the last 100 years on cosmetics and fashion. And as the world feminized itself, women were even more lured into this consumption element, which when you consume, you don't think about the future, you think about now. And also, obviously, having less children makes you having more time to think about having fun and being in the now. This is not bad, but it's just something that takes you away from thinking about the bad times ahead.
Let me stop you here and just ask you, do you think that you're running a risk in the currently hysterical political climate in speaking for or about women?
Let's say theoretically and intellectually, yes, there is a risk. But let's face it, I mean, the current very strange postmodern how do you call this, the social justice warriors and all these crazy people who seem to make arguments about anything. First of all, it's a luxury of very rich people who have time to care about silly things and have time to care about having their feelings triggered and microaggressions and all this nonsense. I mean, that may be an intellectual risk. People who may troll me online because of that book. Yeah, it may happen. But I'm 200 pounds. I weigh 200 pounds and I do a lot of sports. There's no physical risk. There's no risk. And I'm licensed gun owner as well. So there's no risk in reality. And I think a lot of people who are into this debate with these people, they shouldn't be in the debate. We should just dismiss all of this as nonsense and go on with our lives and our preparations and our preparing the future. Because honestly, if I want to be very blunt, all of these people, they're all going to die in the next years or decades. Because if the world really goes the way it's starting to go, it's a survival thing, and these guys are not prepared for survival, which is one of the conclusions of my book, by the way.
Do you detect any differences in the ways that women and men express themselves on the subject of economic and social collapse?
It depends, of course, it depends a lot of the social class and of course, first of all, you need to have time to think. And unfortunately, our world has enslaved women just as it had enslaved men before. And we must not forget that I have a little chapter on women have been liberated, but liberated from what?
Yeah, that was one of my questions that was coming up.
If it's being liberated from men, they've never been enslaved by men. However, the question is, have they been liberated from the bonds of being part of the family, which is sort of small business, whose purpose is to create new humans and get them hopefully better than the former generation? If so, they have been liberated to be now enslaved into consumption, into consumerism, and enslaved to big corporate businesses. And as you know, I'm not an anti-capitalist by far. I'm really not. I'm not even from the left, or what you would call in the US, I guess, liberals. I'm more a libertarian guy, if you see the approach. I'm more like live and let live, and let people do what they want, and let's not have the state organize our lives as much as we can. But certainly today, I think that we're all enslaved. We're all put into this pressure, this economic horror, where we must work to make money so that we can feed our ego and our consumption drives, and happy motoring and all that. And this is a slavery that we got ourselves into, and that women were made believe that they were suddenly became free. But they didn't become free. They enslaved themselves to another kind of slave, which is a much more cruel and terrible master than maybe the husband or whatever you would describe patriarchy, which I also doubt was ever a real tyranny. I mean, the woman had a lot of power in the families in the past, everywhere in the world. Of course, we can debate that in some cultures, women had a more important part than in some others. I mean, of course, we cannot compare even medieval Britain with current Saudi Arabia. I mean, there's no comparison. But I'm dealing mostly with the Western countries in my book, but even so, in through the ages, I do mention a little bit that there has been cases of women who were queens, who were free, and even, for example, the Sparta of more than 2,000 years ago, women had just the same rights as men and were allowed to inherit. They were allowed to have property. Women could have slaves. I mean, so there has been a lot of cases where women had very important social, legally, they had important parts of society. I really wonder if women are not worse off today than they were 50 or 100 years ago in some cases.
Do you think that contemporary feminism has harmed relations between men and women? And does this leave us less than well prepared for the discontinuities that we're facing?
The second part of your question is really the point of my book. I think, yes, to get the first part, to some extent, it's only fair and normal that when a group of people, whether they're women or whether they are a minority, whatever, when they start to play a part in the economy, they need to have representation, and therefore they need to have civil rights, and therefore they have a part of the society, in the society. So it has been just a normal evolution that with the women's role in the economy growing, their rights and the civil rights have also grown. But we also forgot about basic anthropology. And there are some anthropological rules which are hardwired in our brains, and that make us behave the way we do, not because it's a social construct, as the 1960s and 70s theories went. And, why not have theories? I mean, it's very well to explore different approaches of society. But when you you hit the wall of anthropology and instinct, then you have to recognize that it doesn't work. And I think that's where the the second and third wave of feminism made the big mistake is that they were not anymore for the equal rights or allowing women to access political rights and equal pay for jobs and access. But rather they started to be in a war against men and putting men down as much as they can. So this is not the topic that I'm really dealing into the book, but just I think it's important to mention that it did push men and women to forget that we need to have a kind of teamwork to make it through difficult times. And we've been, in a way, fortunate that there's not been difficult times really in the last 50 years, although a growing number of Americans and Europeans are starting to have very difficult economic times over the last decade. Mm-hmm. And it's getting worse. And I don't know if anyone can make America or Europe great again, but it would be nice enough if we could still be around in the future, let alone. But that aside, yes, I think that this system, and you describe it as well in your books, has made us very fragile and very weak, not only in the terms of infrastructure, but also in the terms of the behavior of individuals within the sexes, which are, of course, obviously needed to be complementary to make a society work, because we need to grow healthy children into healthy adults. And if men and women fight, if women and women have bizarre roles and bizarre examples for the children, first of all, the psychological environment for the kids to grow up becomes weird, becomes strange, and the emulation of that will make these children even more unadapted to relationships. And we see today how difficult it is for men and women to get along, to understand each other. So again, my book is not about psychology and marital counseling, but certainly I think there is an important part of that situation into making us even more fragile, assuming whatever future happens, but especially assuming a future that is going to be with less energy, much less luxuries and comfort. When comfort goes away, people get stressed, and when you are stressed, all these psychological problems rise up, and people become violent. And this is and this is where I conclude the first part of my book, is that eventually violence is what the world has always attempted to protect the woman from. Men want to protect their women, their daughters, and generally speaking, the women of the society they are part of, from violence. When we know that violence towards women is especially unacceptable for men, because we all have mothers, we all have women, possibly, and daughters. And violence with women is not just beating up; it has an element of sexual predation, and once again, it's about reproduction, eventually, and power. So there is an instinct of men to traditionally protect women, but because of that new situation, we have been trained not to protect women anymore. And if society becomes more difficult and therefore more violent, the question is, who is going to protect the woman? And in history, it shows that when women are not protected by men, they get beaten, raped, and enslaved. And look at what's happened in Syria over the last 2 years, where suddenly a new barbarian group of people has conquered part of the country, and they have literally enslaved and sold for sex slaves a lot of the women they conquered. And there's been forced marriages, including of the very young women, very young girls. And this is unfortunately not the exception. This is the norm in human history. And this is what civilization has attempted to avoid forever. And this is now starting to happen again. And this is extremely worrisome. And I was surprised that women don't get that. At least most women don't get that. At least not for the moment. So I really wanted to write a book to warn women that, you have to really think hard about these elements. And this is why I interview, and I put in the book, I think about more than 20 or 25 interviews of women who I think get it and are doing something about it. And obviously, not being a woman myself, despite having a lot of imagination, I just can't do it. It was much more interesting to let women speak and tell about their experiences than just making a theoretical book.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that, and I'm going to in a little while, but first I want to ask you something a little different. You have lived in America for long periods of time, correct?
Yeah.
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 Tell me how you view whether there is any difference in behavior and manners and attitudes in European women and the American women that you lived amongst. So I'm curious what you think about that, especially in relation to how they may or may not be prepared and equipped for a big change in everyday life in our world.
So obviously it's very difficult to generalize. And I've had dealings with women, obviously, in the U.S., mostly in job and work-oriented environments, not really intimate, not so much.
Mm-hmm.
So I can judge on a superficial level, and of course throughout only maybe 40 years of my life, not more than that. So I can only say about the last 40 years. I would say that generally there's two big differences. I think women in the U.S. are much more independent, much more work-driven and career-driven than European women. In general, less traditional in the sense that, the woman must stay home and take care of the kids. Of course, there is exception. I mean, you cannot compare the working woman of Manhattan to the woman in the farm in Minnesota, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
This is, I don't want to people to believe that I think that America is just Manhattan and San Francisco, where I used to live and work. Now, the women in Europe, they are traditional in a different way. They are still into the approach of, they are probably more in the seductive approach towards life. I'm not saying that they go through life by seducing people at all, but they are more into, I need to look good, I need to look feminine, because it's part of being a woman and it's part of something that they feel good when people look at them. And obviously, once again, I don't want to generalize. There's a big difference from a woman from Portugal, from a woman in Sweden, and from Scotland to Sicily. And as you know, Europe is extremely diverse. Mm-hmm. And there is a huge difference between a Russian woman and let's say, Eastern European to a Western Europe. But that said, in terms of facing the future, I would say that there are even less people less women in Europe who think about the future as women in the US, because probably the European women are much more leaning towards the left and therefore believing in the religion of progress, in the sense that the world will always be good. And as long as you have good intention, as long as you have some posturing of leftist ideas, the future is going to be good anyway.
Or better.
Or better. However, let me say that I'm not saying that the people on the conservative side or on the right side are less believing in the religion of progress too. They just do it in a different way. Mm-hmm. But certainly, I think that there is more women in proportion, in percentage, in the US that actually are preparing and caring. And even in the interviews I made, the interview of American women who prepare, their preparation is much more advanced and thought through than the ones in Europe. Mm-hmm. I thought.
There's a popular trope that is often expressed by women themselves. I mean, I've heard it many, many times. And this trope states that women generally dislike other women or don't trust them or are suspicious of them. As a man, I suppose this is largely about, competition and status issues and things like that. Is there anything to it? Is there any truth to it? How have you observed this?
Let's assume no women are listening to us tonight.
I don't think that's a good assumption.
No, but
there may be a few out there.
It is, as long as my wife doesn't listen, I can still be okay. No, the serious thing is that, seriously, the reality is that, of course, it's very difficult to generalize it. And of course, as a man, and not being a sociologist and not being a psychologist, so obviously not having women who come to my therapy by the dozen every day.
Well, first of all, Piero, Have you heard this trope? I mean,
Oh
I
yes.
can't.
Oh,
I'm not
yes.
alone
No,
in
no, I've
sensing this.
heard
Am
it
I?
and I've seen it. I'm just saying that I've not seen all of them.
Yeah, yeah, sure.
Thank goodness. But definitely I've seen it, and I think there are some roots in anthropology. And I've read a lot of anthropology for this book and for other projects. And it seems to me that men tend to solve problems. When you talk anthropology, you talk about evolution over millions of years, at least hundreds of thousands of years. Males tend to solve problems related to territory, reproduction, and general status through fighting themselves, usually not to death within the same group, usually for status. And that's why we invented language and ideas and debate and philosophy, so that we can eventually avoid more violence when we discuss of that. Women tend to be more verbal. And in fact, the way they express and the words they choose can sometimes have more edge than muscles and knuckles, as anyone who has been married sometimes has experienced. Sometimes it can hurt men in ways that we can never hurt them. And I should say that sometimes, unfortunately, this is what triggers some men to go overboard and use physical violence against women, which I don't condone, but sometimes it's explained by some harsh words that men can't reply, and therefore, instead of verbalizing what they feel, they hit back, and it's bad. But this is an exception. Unfortunate. So, and the women themselves, therefore, within themselves, they don't fight the same way as we would. They don't intimidate through physical force. Usually, it's verbal, and this has been observed through by anthropologists and ethnologists. When they studied very tribes in Papua New Guinea, in Amazon, in Africa, where people are still living the way we used to live 50 or 60,000 years ago. And they're observing that a lot of women are extremely hard within themselves for status, for power, through verbal intimidation and verbal violence, but not physical violence. So it could be that this is leading us to men being, we tend to collaborate more between men within themselves, except when it's about women.
Interesting.
Maybe because I've never heard of male solidarity when it's about chasing women. All fight for the best and best looking ones and so on. However, women tend to be maybe a little bit more collaborative when it's about men, when it's about seducing men, but less collaborative when it's about status. And it could be because they're more verbally acute, and this is something that a lot of psychologists confirm. And this verbal prowess basically makes them very easy to fight between themselves. At least this is the anthropological explanation. And then once again, I'm not a specialist, so maybe in our audience people can comment and tell us their opinion. But I've heard this before, and I've seen this in many businesses. In businesses, sometimes when we know a lot of businesses have this very weird policy of, instead of hiring people or promoting people because of their skills, it's because of they are part of the minority or part of a gender, and suddenly you have people who are promoted. I've heard many people, I think even the author Scott Adams was telling this very eloquently, that in many businesses, after a certain level and pay grade, you can't be promoted if you're a white man. And it makes no sense, because it's all about, businesses are supposed to, make profit and have happy customers, and who cares about who you are and what you do and who you represent, as long as you are honest working and productive. But no, this seems to have gone weird this way. And yes, in many cases you have a lot of women promoted to boards, and I've seen this in boards I was in. Women sometimes, not always, they can be backstabbing, cruel pricks just like us.
Well, you mentioned that you compiled about 20 narratives, personal narratives of women who are preparing for economic and social change and upheaval in Europe mostly. And I'm wondering what you learned from recording these and from talking to these people.
Yeah. So I interviewed women in France, in Switzerland, in Italy, in Canada, and in the US.
Romania was one of them.
In Romania, a good friend, yes, and also in Israel. And because I wanted to have some different scenarios and different, for example, obviously, a woman in Israel is in a country that has more concerns about real war.
Yes.
Every day. A woman in Romania has concern about criminality or economic difficulties more than a woman in Switzerland, for example.
Mm-hmm.
And women in the U.S. or in France. So and in the people and the women I've interviewed, there are single women, married women, young and older. There's also I think there's some couples of lesbian women who are in partnership together.
Mm-hmm.
So it was fortunate that there is a very wide and diverse group. It's not only the traditional married middle-aged woman. No. They are young, they are older, they are different sexual orientation. It was quite interesting to see that. Very interesting to see that. What impressed me, first of all, is that there is no paranoia. None of them is about these caricature that sometimes the media make of people who prepare about the future and they say, oh, look at them, they are storing food for Armageddon or for the end of the world. It's so funny. No, none of them. If you store food, it's because eventually the supply chains may break down if there's a crisis. And most of them grow food and they can food themselves for the winter. They are pragmatic and they are not paranoid. A lot of these women learn to defend themselves. Some do martial arts. Most of them learn to have a gun and to use it. They are very moderate, and none of them is talking about this nonsense end of the world or even if some of them were religious. I mean, I know there were some people who were the Christian who do believe into the rapture, these things.
Mm-hmm.
But they were not saying that they prepare because that, which is logical, by the way, because if you're saved, then you don't need to prepare. But they do prepare for crisis, for logical things. So it was interesting to see that. Mm-hmm. And the other thing that impressed me a lot is that most of them, including the lesbian couples, they were very respectful and concerned in the right way that men and women should not fight and should not compete. They must collaborate, and we are meant to collaborate. Mm-hmm. And that within the family, within the couple, or even with your neighbors, men and women are just valuable parts of a small society, if it's a neighborhood. And as valuable parts of a small society, they must know each other, they must understand each other, they must collaborate, exchange, and this leads to, and they were all saying something like that, it leads to a happier life. And mm-hmm. and this is something that is very dear to me, because it's really one of the messages that I'm trying to reach, is that these, whether you call it prepping or survivalism or just common sense, preparing yourselves with your neighbors, within your family, or even if it's you just alone, it's not about survival. It's about a better life. Of course, in difficult times, you save your ass, you save your skin, but in the remainder of the days, we're not. And these women likewise, we're not just happy because we have a better life with homegrown food in some cases, with better relationships with our neighbors, with more genuine and real relationship, or at least we try, with our children and our families, and hey, even better sex life with our spouses, because when you click and when you get along, even that is much better, especially after a few years when you're married. So I'm trying to get with my books to people, to tell them, look, you can be more happy by being concerned about the future. And I was very pleased to see that even some of these women I never met, I interviewed them over the phone, especially the ones in the US, and they were on this. Of course, they have different preparations, but the philosophical and the bottom line of what they get from all this is more harmony, better life, more happiness, and this is very important for me.
It's very rare these days for children to be taught much in the way of useful knowledge or the practical household arts like gardening or putting up food or preserving it, sewing, first aid, any of these really practical things. In fact, I'd go so far to say that a lot of these things are considered rather silly these days in many households. Is that going to be a problem?
Yes, I think it is, because you always have to think, what if the world continues to grow and be the way it is now, or even, between commas, better?
Mm-hmm.
Well, knowing how to take responsibilities and understanding how things are made, first of all, it gets you to understand the value. And, when I was a kid, I once took some scissors and I, by mistake, cut my sweater. I can tell you, my parents were not super wealthy, but they were wealthy enough to not care about the sweater. But I can tell you, I still remember the shouting about cutting my own sweater, because I needed to understand that stuff is bought with money, but money doesn't grow on trees. It's something that you need to work hard and labor hard to work for. And it seems today that everything made in China is so cheap, and everything it has to be thrown away after 6 months, and it doesn't, whether it's furniture from IKEA to clothes to electronic gadgets, everything is consumable and throwable, and therefore you don't care anymore of how they make it, how you recycle. Yeah, sure, we recycle paper and cans, but this is again, it's nice to do, but it's more of a posture. We don't care about how things are made, and some people do, of course. Some people buy, and they should eat local and buy local, but generally speaking, we're a wasteful society with no understanding of how things work. No one understands how the supply chains that fill our Walmarts and stores work, mm-hmm. and how fragile they are, and because they're so efficient that they became fragile. No one understands. Well, of course, now with Black Lives Matters and things like that, mediatized, people start to realize that maybe there is a risk of violence. But before that, for many people, especially people who live in communities far away from the poor areas, everything was always so nice and so neat, and you have your security system. You don't realize how violence can be quick and fast and to take over you. Mm-hmm. So people don't care. So indeed, children, I always remember that, for a lot of us, when we were kids, the phone was technology. And then maybe from my generation, phone was just a tool, while computer was technology. For kids today, a computer is not technology. It's just some stuff they have always had in their hands. And I don't know what's technology for Generation Z now. I don't know. I really don't know what they perceive as technology. For them, everything is so obvious. Like a fridge is a fridge for us, but probably for the generation of your father and my father too, a fridge was a wonderful technology.
Yes, it's a very good point.
Yeah, so for them, everything is, they take everything for granted. I don't want to sound too much of an old fart already to say, and I used to go to school uphill both ways and all that. It's not their fault. It's just the way it is. Why would they learn to sew, and why would they learn to mend their clothes when a T-shirt costs $5? Mm-hmm. Why would you waste your time? And my point is that even if things go well, it's skills that teach you the value of life and of things. Because when you understand the value of life, maybe you take care of yourself a bit better, and therefore you live it a little bit more to the fullest. And I'm sure my friend Anthony Robbins would agree on that. But on the other hand, if things go bad, and you and I unfortunately know that they will, and I'm absolutely convinced they will, well, then these skills may help you to have a trade, to have a job. Maybe they help you simply survive. And therefore, it's not a question of whether it's good or have. You must have them. And if you don't, it's going to be very hard to learn, because you don't have any more trial and error. You don't have time for that. And so it's important. And I think, these two elements, it teaches you something, and it may save your life. I mean, metaphorically, but not also literally. But I have 4 kids, and it's very hard to teach them, because they compare to other kids and they say, well, my friend doesn't need to do all that. So you have to use a lot of psychology to teach them. Well, kung fu is good for you, because it's you can defend yourself, and it's great. And maybe look at how this tomato tastes much better. You know what? Because you grew it, and it was in our garden, and it's much more tasty and better and has more, and it makes you grow better than the other. So we need to use a little bit of psychology and maybe how you say what's the word for religion? You have to inculcate it's a sort of faith. You have to, when you can program your kids to believe into whatever silly thing when they're young.
Uh-huh.
If you tell them, there's an old man in the sky that will punish you if you don't worship him. These kind of silly things that you can teach people and young children. Well, instead of that, you teach them that, a free man is a man who can defend himself. A decent man or woman is someone who is free and can grow his own food. So sometimes you have to use a little bit of that. Although I'm personally believing in the fact that children should learn to think by themselves. But usually when you bring arguments saying, well, look, the world may not always work the way it is now. And if it doesn't, how do you feed yourself? Think, where does food grow from? Does it grow in the supermarket? Is it growing into these under plastic wraps in Walmart? Or does it grow from the garden as I showed you? And then which one tastes better? The answer is usually pretty obvious. So, yeah, it's a long word, though.
While we're in the world of psychology, here's something that I'm wondering about. Can female survivalists or women who are interested in anticipating a very different future economy, can they remain feminine? And is femininity necessary in human relations? And what does it mean to you?
Obviously, when you look around, femininity is very much in the eye of the beholder, with one or two exceptions, in the sense that I think that, there's morbidly fat women are usually not attractive to no men. Mm-hmm. And usually there is also another thing that in medicine they teach you is that, the total loss of hair through illness is also something that usually men don't find attractive. But other than that, men will basically find roughly women feminine. I mean, it is in the eye of the beholder, except with those exceptions. That said, preparing oneself and does not preclude being feminine. I can tell you that one of the women in the book, I think the one named Jessie, if you could see her, it's just, you would be wow. Not only is she a babe, but very, very, very sexy. And she has a cow, and she teaches her children to grow food in the garden, and she has this family lives in is autonomous and has no waste, natural waste disposal and all that. Very, very, very nice. And yet, wow, I can tell you, she is a beautiful and sexy woman. So why not? And I must say that, for me, for example, I did some training last year with the French police to have a discussion, for example, with how they use tactically weapons in terms of anti-terrorism combat. Mm-hmm. And some of these policewomen were I can tell you, they were very attractive using their guns. So it could be my fetish. It could be a fetish of mine. I don't know. But certainly, I do not think that femininity is antinomious with being responsible and preparing. And hey, some people find a businesswoman and attractive and feminine. So there is really, it's more an attitude and a way of being than linked with the job or your activity. Hey, we've all seen Flashdance, the worker, blue-collar woman being sexy, so it's okay.
Yeah. I think we sometimes overlook how strange contemporary culture actually is. And, for example, I wonder how much has this climate of immersive pornography changed the dynamic of maleness and femininity?
It's a good point, because what pushes men to obviously to work hard is to eventually gain the necessary status to, and in the old days it was very formalized. Now it's much less, obviously, but to seduce women with which they can have a family. And in some cultures today, you don't marry if you are not some wealth. And in some traditional cultures, I'm thinking of North Africa, and where you need to show that you have succeeded a bit. And the more you've succeeded, the more you can access women from better families and usually better looking women, something like that. So that's very traditional families. This is not the West. But in the West, still, we know that, I've never seen a man with a Ferrari with an ugly woman with it. So there is still something that goes on that is about woman attraction for status, which usually translates into money and power, but not necessarily, but usually it does. Once again, I'm not generalizing. I'm sure that people will say, no, okay, it's a generalization. And likewise, most men look for attractive, the best reproduction into women. Once again, it's anthropology. It goes very far into our past. Pornography probably enables us to not have this delayed gratification that is, well, if I work hard and I gain status, I get the woman of my dream. For men, pornography means, well, I don't care. I have a million women of my dreams immediately, right now, on my phone. But that said, the most interesting stat is 45% of porn is watched by women. So it's almost half. So the question is...
I didn't know that.
Oh, no. If you look at the statistics from the main websites of the industry, 45% is from women. So the question begets is, why do they look at it? And what kind of immediate gratification they get besides masturbatory pleasure? Oh, that's obvious. But does that impact women's psychology into how they must work hard to look good so that they attract men? Maybe it also plays into the woman not needing to look good because they have immediate gratification in form of porn, and therefore they don't need to look good, and therefore they just can work. I'm not a woman, so I cannot say that, and I've not read studies, but one can speculate, and once again, people who listen to us can probably tell us what they think, but it is a phenomenon that goes beyond just men and also young men. So it's this is definitely something that, while pornography has always existed, it has also been hidden. Now it's not. Now it's everywhere and it's accessible. I mean, even in Europe, we have millions of invading migrants who get here every year, and what the governments do is, besides giving them money, they give them a phone with internet connection with which they can access porn, obviously. And so the question is, why are we helping millions of young men from Africa and Middle East to watch porn? Is this going to impact the rape statistics in Europe? Obviously it does. So this is a very strange. So now technology and a very old trade, which is pornography, is suddenly becoming accessible to every young boy and girl. And this is something that has never happened. Probably it's not going to be good. Probably, what could go wrong? I think a lot of things.
Well, we're nearing the end of this hour, and I have one more question for you.
Sure.
We're talking about it off mic earlier, but where are we now in this historical moment of Western civilization with Trump and Brexit and possibly Le Pen and possibly Mr. Wilders in the Netherlands and other converging personalities and events and changes in the political life of the West? Where are we now?
Well, remember, we discussed this a year ago, a bit more than a year ago. I did predict that Trump would be elected.
Oh, I don't remember. You did, huh?
But I did. I have videos on my YouTube to prove it. In December 2015, I said, well, you know what? I think Trump is going to be the next president of the United States in a year. Everybody made fun of me, of course. But for me, why did I predict that? It's not just the guy and the skills or personality. We are at a time where there is the little people have enough with the difficult economic that they have to go through. They have enough of not having any voice. Their ideas, whatever they are, and however, the question is not whether they are sound or wise or good or bad, but they don't have representation anymore. They have been crushed by political correctness. They have been crushed by elites, by the establishment who clearly does not work for them, and they have enough. And you see this phenomenon in the United States, I think, I think you see this phenomenon in UK, in most of Europe. And people want strong leaders which have sometimes way too simple, but sometimes simple solutions to complex problems. And for a while, these people will be happy to have some representation of people who look like them, who will, at least, whether it's genuine or not, they will pay lip service to what the vast majority of people want. And this explains the wave of whether you call it populist, whether you call it right wing, doesn't matter. But the people have a voice. Now, I'm a democratic guy. I'm Swiss. In Switzerland, we love democracy, and I do that, and I do love it. However, democracy doesn't necessarily mean that you take the right choices. It just means that you take the choices that most people want. If you ask what people want, sometimes you're appalled. Just go to a Walmart. And I'm a guy who thought that Trump was the way better candidate compared to the other one. I'm actually impressed that you have a guy who's actually doing what he promised he would do. So that's quite odd. That's quite not normal.
Yeah.
But and I must say that I'm in perfect agreement with what you wrote for your predictions, the yearly predictions for 2017. I think that no one can make America great again. No one can make Europe great again. No one can make the world great again because it's impossible. And so there's going to be even more frustration. It's not going to be Mr. Trump's fault or Mr. Le Pen or I don't know who's going to be elected in Europe. I think in Holland, in the Netherlands, it's going to be a much more uncertain election than in France, for example. But you see the same trend everywhere. Mm-hmm. But in the end, all of these people will be very disappointed because it's not going to change.
Well, they're not going to bring back 1963 again.
No, impossible. And again, and for example, in Europe, there is this big now wave of sentiment against Islam. And I understand it, and actually I agree. But Islam is not the cause of the problems that we're facing. It's a symptom. Mm-hmm. And mass immigration is a symptom of the world collapsing little by little, and it is collapsing first in the periphery. It's collapsing in the countries which have never been organized properly, where maybe, yes, there are countries where the average IQ is very low, and therefore they can't organize themselves and therefore people have no other way than move to the next country, which gets destabilized. And yes, I understand all that, but this is not this is a symptom. This is a consequence of very profound problems, the ones that you describe in your book, that I describe in my first book. What I'm really concerned is that indeed, when people will get disappointed, it may accelerate violence and chaos. And once again, we go back to this is why I wanted to warn women, because let's face it, at least I love women. First of all, it's the better-looking half of humanity. But we love them. I mean, they're our mothers, they're our sisters, they are our wives and spouses, partners, girlfriends, they are our daughters. And you know what? We men don't really matter. They matter. We want to protect them. They make children. They are humanity's future. Okay, we need to collaborate, and I will not accept women to rule over me, but they are the more important part. Mm-hmm. So I don't want them to be beaten, enslaved, sold as sex slaves on the market like it happened in Syria. I don't want to see my daughters and my wife, and no, I don't want that. It is unacceptable. So it's my duty, as much as I can, and with my little skills, to write and tell them to be aware of what's happening, to learn and think for themselves that maybe the goal of your life is not to buy the next stiletto heel shoe or the next handbag, and maybe the purpose of your life is not to work for a career, which usually means you're a glorified secretary. If you're lucky, and if you're not lucky, you're just a cash teller at Walmart again. So, what is this career they tell you about? Do you work because you have this weird dream of independence, or is it because you have to? Because no one can pay the rent with one salary anymore. So really think hard. Why are we enslaving ourselves to work? Why are we enslaving ourselves to the new dogma of, women must work? Well, why? If I can choose not to work, I don't want to work necessarily. So why are they telling us, and what are we losing doing that, especially in terms of preparing the future and having a good life and a happy life, with whether we're single or with children, doesn't matter. But I think there's more to life than career, work, and the alienation of consumption.
Well, it's been a pleasure talking to you about your new book, which is called Women on the Verge of Societal Breakdown, Preserving Hard-Won Victories During an Age of Uncertainty. It's published by the Dmitry Orlov Press.
Yep.
And it's available on the web. One good place to go to get it would be Dimitri's website, Club Orlov. Is it on Amazon as well?
I think it all goes to Amazon. If you go on Amazon and you type Piero San Giorgio, Italian, you get it.
Okay, very good. We will ride again, Piero, and we'll check in and see how things are going in 6 months. I think it's going to be a very interesting first half of the year.